If you could meet the first person who looked exactly like you, same bone structure, same brain capacity, same potential for language and thought, where would that meeting take place? The answer isn't what most history books suggest. Because the oldest anatomically modern human fossils ever discovered weren't found in Mesopotamia. They weren't found in Greece or Rome or anywhere in Asia. They were found in Africa. Specifically, in the Omo Fossils formation in southern Ethiopia. And they're not 10,000 years old, or 50,000. They're 195,000 years old. Which means that while the first cities of Mesopotamia wouldn't emerge for another 190,000 years, the first humans, genetically identical to everyone alive today, were already walking, talking, and creating tools on the African continent. This is the story of what they looked like. And why it took us so long to accept the truth. For most of recorded history, we had no scientific framework for understanding human origins. Creation myths filled the gap. Every culture told its own story about where people came from. These were profound narratives, but they weren't archaeology. They weren't biology. The scientific search for human origins began in earnest in the 19th century, at the height of European colonial expansion. And that timing would shape everything that followed, not just what we discovered, but what we believed those discoveries meant. When Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, he intentionally avoided the question of human evolution. The subject was too controversial. But 12 years later, in The Descent of Man, he made a prediction. He wrote that humanity likely originated in Africa, because that's where our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, still lived. It was a logical hypothesis based on biogeography. But it was almost universally rejected by the European scientific establishment. Why? Because in the late 1800s, much of Africa was under colonial rule. The continent was being described in European literature as primitive, uncivilized, without history. The idea that humanity itself originated there contradicted the racial hierarchies that justified colonialism. So instead, scientists looked elsewhere. They found Neanderthal fossils in Germany, Homo erectus in Java, Peking man in China. Each discovery seemed to validate the assumption that humanity arose in Europe or Asia, anywhere but Africa. But then the evidence began to mount. And it became impossible to ignore. In 1924, a young anatomist named Raymond Dart was working at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He received a shipment of fossils from a limestone quarry at Tong, about 300 kilometers southwest of the city. Among them was a small skull, clearly a child, but unlike anything catalogued before. It had an ape-like face. But the position of the foramen magnum, the hole where the spinal cord enters the skull, indicated that it walked upright. And its brain was larger than any known ape of comparable size. Dart named it Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape of Africa. He published his findings in the journal Nature in 1925. The response from European scientists was dismissive. They called it an aberrant chimpanzee. They questioned Dart's credentials. Some suggested he'd been misled by poorly preserved remains. But Dart was correct. He had discovered one of our distant ancestors. And it was African. Over the following decades, more fossils emerged. In the 1930s and 40s, Robert Broom discovered additional Australopithecus specimens in South Africa, strengthening Dart's case. In the 1950s, Lewis and Mary Leakey began excavating in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, a site so rich in prehistoric remains it would become known as the cradle of mankind. Then came the discovery that changed everything. In 1974, Donald Johansson and his team were surveying a site in the Afar region of Ethiopia when they found a partial skeleton of a hominin that lived 3.2 million years ago. They named her Lucy. Lucy wasn't human. She was Australopithecus afarensis, a species that walked upright but retained many ape-like features. But her skeleton showed a clear evolutionary trajectory, one that pointed toward us. Still, Lucy wasn't Homo sapiens. The question remained, when did anatomically modern humans first appear? And what did they look like? The answer would come from two sites, both in Ethiopia, both staggering in their implications. In 1967, a team led by Richard Leakey discovered fragmentary remains near the Omo River in southern Ethiopia. The fossils included parts of a skull and skeletal fragments. Initial dating suggested they were around 130,000 years old, already older than any modern human remains found outside Africa at the time. But in 2005, new radiometric dating techniques were applied. The results were published in the journal Nature. The Omo fossils were not 130,000 years old. They were 195,000 years old. To put that in perspective, when these individuals lived, there were no cities, no agriculture, no domesticated animals. The first known city in Mesopotamia, Europe, wouldn't be founded for another 190,000 years. The pyramids of Egypt wouldn't be built for another 192,000 years. And yet, the skull structure of Omo is unmistakably modern. The cranium is high and rounded. The face is flat, not prognathic. The chin is present and prominent, a uniquely human feature. The estimated brain volume is approximately 1,400 cubic centimeters, within the range of modern humans. If you place this skull next to the skull of someone alive today, the differences would be negligible. But Omo wasn't the only evidence. In 1997, at a site called Herto in the Middle Awash region of Ethiopia, paleoanthropologist Tim White and his team discovered 3 skulls in remarkable condition. They were dated using argon-argon radiometric techniques, a method that measures the decay of radioactive isotopes in volcanic rock layers surrounding the fossils. The result, 160,000 years old, with a margin of error of plus or minus 2,000 years. The skulls were so well preserved that scientists could reconstruct the faces in extraordinary detail. The individuals were classified as Homo sapiens idaltu, a subspecies of modern humans, but anatomically identical in all significant respects. The largest skull, likely an adult male, had a brain capacity of approximately 1,450 cubic centimeters. That's slightly above the modern human average. The morphology was modern, a vertical forehead, minimal brow ridge, pronounced chin, and a rounded occipital region at the back of the skull. These weren't archaic humans waiting to evolve into something better. They were us. And they lived in Africa 160,000 years ago, long before modern humans are known to have existed anywhere else on Earth. Fossils give us bone structure. But soft tissue, skin, hair, eyes doesn't fossilize. So how do we know what these early humans looked like? The answer lies in evolutionary biology, genetics, and the environment they lived in. The Omo River Valley and the Middle Awash region of Ethiopia are located near the equator, where ultraviolet radiation from the sun is intense. UV radiation penetrates the skin and breaks down folate, a vitamin critical for DNA synthesis and cell division. Without adequate folate, sperm production drops. Pregnancy becomes difficult. Infant mortality rises. The human body's defense against UV radiation is melanin, the pigment that gives skin its color. The more melanin you produce, the darker your skin, and the more protected you are. Genetic studies have confirmed that the genes responsible for lighter skin, such as SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, are recent mutations. They appear only in populations that migrated to northern latitudes within the last 40,000 to 50,000 years. The ancestral human condition, the genetic baseline, is dark skin. This isn't speculation. It's measurable. The first humans had skin the color of the African soil they walked on, rich brown to deep black. Their hair was tightly coiled. This isn't arbitrary. Curly hair creates an insulating layer between the scalp and the sun, trapping air while allowing heat to dissipate. It's a natural cooling system, perfectly adapted to the African climate. Their bodies were tall and lean, with long limbs and narrow torsos. This body type maximizes surface area relative to volume, making it easier to shed heat through sweating. It's why populations that still live near the equator, the Maasai, the Dinka, the Turkana, retain similar builds today. Their noses were broad with wide nostrils. In hot, dry climates, this shape allows air to be humidified before it reaches the lungs, preventing respiratory stress. Every physical trait of the first humans was sculpted by Africa. They weren't generic proto-humans. They were fully adapted, fully modern people living in the place where humanity began. But we don't just have fossils and morphology. We have DNA. In 1987, a team of geneticists led by Alan Wilson published a landmark study in the journal Nature. They analyzed mitochondrial DNA genetic material passed exclusively from mother to child from 147 people representing diverse populations around the world. Their goal was to trace human ancestry backward through time. What they found was unequivocal: all living humans share a common maternal ancestor who lived in Africa between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The media called her mitochondrial Eve. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time. She wasn't literally the biblical Eve. But her mitochondrial lineage survived through an unbroken chain of daughters, while other lineages died out. Today, every person on Earth, regardless of where they live or what they look like, carries her mitochondrial DNA. A parallel study using Y chromosome DNA, which is passed from father to son, identified Y chromosomal Adam, a man who lived in Africa around the same time. Again, he wasn't the only man. But his paternal lineage endured. These aren't myths. They're genetic facts, replicated in study after study over the past 4 decades. Humanity didn't evolve independently in different regions of the world. We all descend from a small population that lived in Africa during the Middle Stone Age. Your DNA remembers Africa. So does mine. Around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago, a small group of humans left Africa. The evidence for this comes from genetics, fossil finds, and archaeological sites across the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and eventually the Americas. Why they left is still debated. Climate change may have made parts of Africa less hospitable. Curiosity and the search for new resources likely played a role. Humans are, by nature, explorers. They crossed into the Arabian Peninsula, possibly through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the mouth of the Red Sea when sea levels were lower during the last ice age. From there, they moved east along the coasts of South Asia, reaching Australia by 65,000 years ago. Others moved north into Central Asia, then west into Europe and east into East Asia. By 15,000 years ago, humans had crossed into the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge. And as they moved, their appearance changed. In northern latitudes, where UV radiation is weaker, dark skin became a disadvantage. The human body needs some UV exposure to produce vitamin D, which is essential for bone health and immune function. Natural selection favored mutations that reduced melanin production. Over thousands of generations, lighter skin emerged in populations living in Europe and Northern Asia. Hair texture diversified. In colder climates, straighter hair provided better insulation against the cold. Body types shifted toward shorter, stockier builds that conserved heat more efficiently. These changes happened relatively recently within the last 50,000 years. They are superficial adaptations to local environments, not fundamental transformations of what it means to be human. Beneath the surface, we are all those first Africans. It's worth pausing to put these dates in perspective. The oldest Homo sapiens fossils from Africa, Omo, are dated to 195,000 years ago. The oldest known city in Mesopotamia is Uruk, in what is now Iraq. It was founded around 4000 BCE, approximately 6,000 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt was built around 2560 BCE, about 4,500 years ago. So when we talk about the first humans, we're not talking about people who were slightly older than the ancient Egyptians or Sumerians. We're talking about people who lived 190,000 years before the pyramids were even conceived. For 185,000 years, modern humans lived as hunter-gatherers. They made tools from stone, bone, and wood. They created art, ochre drawings, beadwork, symbolic carvings. They developed language, storytelling, and culture. But they didn't build cities. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because agriculture hadn't been invented yet. And without agriculture, you don't have surplus food. Without surplus food, you can't support large, sedentary populations. The agricultural revolution began around 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent, the region stretching from modern-day Egypt through the Levant and into Mesopotamia. But it also emerged independently in sub-Saharan Africa around the same time, with the domestication of crops like sorghum, millet, and yams in the Sahel region. Cities followed. Writing followed. Monuments followed. But the people who built those cities, in Uruk, in Memphis, in Babylon, were biologically identical to the people who lived 195,000 years earlier in the Omo River Valley. The difference wasn't in their biology. It was in their circumstances. Given the overwhelming fossil and genetic evidence, why did it take so long for the African origin of humanity to be accepted? The answer is uncomfortable, but it's important to state clearly. Science does not operate in a vacuum. It is conducted by people, and people carry biases. When paleoanthropology was emerging as a discipline in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European colonial powers controlled much of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The ideology of the time ranked human populations in a hierarchy, with Europeans at the top. This wasn't just popular belief. It was codified in academic institutions, taught in universities, and reflected in museum exhibits. The idea that humanity originated in Africa contradicted this hierarchy. If Africans were the original humans, if all Europeans, Asians, and Americans descended from African ancestors, it became much harder to justify colonialism, slavery, and racial segregation. So when Raymond Dart discovered Australopithecus in South Africa in 1924, the European scientific establishment dismissed him. When the Leakeys found evidence of early toolmaking in East Africa, some scholars suggested the tools must have been made by migrating populations from elsewhere. Even into the 1980s, some researchers promoted the multi-regional hypothesis, the idea that modern humans evolved independently in different parts of the world from earlier hominins like Homo erectus. This hypothesis has been thoroughly debunked by genetic evidence. But it persisted for decades because it allowed people to believe that different races had separate origins and therefore, perhaps, different capacities. That belief was never supported by evidence. It was supported by ideology. Today, the out of Africa theory is the scientific consensus. It's not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It's what the fossils, the genetics, and the archaeology all confirm. But it took generations of African and allied scientists working often with limited resources and facing institutional resistance to make that truth undeniable. In recent years, forensic artists have used the Herto skulls and other early Homo sapiens remains to create facial reconstructions. The process is meticulous. Scientists measure the thickness of soft tissue at dozens of points on the skull. They reconstruct the musculature of the face. Then they add skin, eyes, hair, and other features based on the bone structure and the population's geographic origin. When they reconstructed the face of the Herto adult male, the result was striking. He had dark brown skin. His hair was black, tightly coiled, and close-cropped. His nose was broad. His lips were full. His eyes were deep-set, with a calm, intelligent expression. He looked like someone you could meet in Addis Ababa or Nairobi today. Because genetically, he was the same as them. Just separated by 160,000 years. Other reconstructions from the Omo remains and South African sites show similar features. The first humans looked African because they were African. For too long, popular depictions of early humans showed them with lighter skin, straighter hair, and more European features. These were not based on evidence. They were based on assumption. The reconstructions we have now are based on science. And they show us the truth: the first face of humanity was unmistakably, undeniably African. So why does any of this matter? Why does it matter what the first humans looked like, or where they lived? Because history shapes identity. And identity shapes how we see each other. For centuries, Africa has been written out of the human story or relegated to a footnote. When history books covered ancient civilizations, they started with Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. Africa, if mentioned at all, was described as a place without history, without culture, without contribution. But the evidence tells a different story. Africa isn't just one cradle of civilization among many. It's the only cradle of humanity. Every language, every culture, every technological innovation, every work of art ever created by humans traces back to minds that descended from those first Africans in the Omo Valley. Ancient Egypt, one of the greatest civilizations in history, was African. Not metaphorically. Geographically, culturally, genetically. The Kingdom of Kush, which built pyramids before and after Egypt, was African. The medieval empires of Mali, Songhai, and Ghana, which controlled trans-Saharan trade routes and produced scholars, architects, and astronomers, were African. Great Zimbabwe, an architectural marvel whose stone structures still stand today, was built by Africans without any external influence. These are not peripheral stories. They are central to the human story. And they all trace back to the same origin point, East Africa, 200,000 years ago, when the first modern humans emerged. Understanding that doesn't diminish other civilizations. It contextualizes them. It reminds us that humanity is one family, with a shared origin and a shared potential. The face of the first human, the original face, was African. And so, in a very real sense, are we all. If you could meet that first person, the one who looked just like you, who thought just like you, who had the same capacity for language, art, love, and wonder, you'd be meeting someone who lived 195,000 years ago in what is now Ethiopia. They didn't know they were the first. They didn't know their descendants would walk on the moon, split the atom, map the human genome, or build cities that touch the sky. They were simply trying to survive. To find food. To care for their children. To make sense of the world around them. But they succeeded. And because they did, we're here. Every time you look in a mirror, you're looking at the result of 195,000 years of survival, adaptation, and resilience. You're looking at the descendant of those first Africans who walked out of the Omo Valley and, eventually, into every corner of the earth. That's not just history. That's heritage. And it belongs to all of us. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe the past should be told accurately, completely, and without bias, then this channel exists for you. There are more untold stories waiting. And we'll keep bringing them to light.